What's going on, Bottom Line viewers? It's Mitch here of the Bottom Line View, back with another NFL debate. And this one, I think I've taken it up to another notch, because this is Jim Brown versus Barry Sanders versus Walter Payton, a three-way debate. Screw those two-way debates, Tom Brady versus Joe Montana, Peyton Manning versus Tom Brady. Thank you guys for watching those videos. I really appreciate it. They're some of the most successful videos on the channel, so I wanted to continue the series. And thank you to Alex, who suggested this video. Walter Payton, Barry Sanders, Jim Brown. We're going to compare their careers. We're going to compare everything about them. Statistics, intangibles, accolades, variables, all that stuff. We're going to compare Jim Brown versus Barry Sanders versus Walter Payton. Very difficult. This was a very difficult video because these guys were so close. This wasn't like Peyton and Brady or Brady and Montana, where it clearly went one way. And if you want to see that conclusion, you can head to those videos. They will be in the description and in the comment section. But in this video, it went right down to the wire. So let's get into it. Starting off with the career statistics. Now, going into this, I thought the career statistics would be heavily in Peyton's favor because Peyton played the most games and he had the best longevity. And I was, in fact, correct. Let's start off by talking about the career attempts. Peyton had 3,838 attempts compared to Sanders' 3,062 and Jim Brown's 2,359. Attempts per game was interesting. Every guy on here, Peyton, Sanders, Brown, they all averaged 20 attempts per game, which was very interesting in my opinion. We then go to rushing yards. Rushing yards department, Walter Payton does take that one as well with 16,726 compared to Barry Sanders' 15,269 and Jim Brown's 12,312. Rushing yards per game is where it starts to get interesting. Jim Brown takes it with over 100 yards per game at 104.3. Barry Sanders at 99.8, and actually Walter Payton only at 88 yards per game. The yards per carry. Jim Brown 5.2, Barry Sanders 5.0, and Walter Payton 4.4. Receptions. How good were they of a receiving back? How much were they utilized as a receiver out of the backfield? Walter Payton, 492 receptions, first place. Barry Sanders, 352, and Jim Brown, 262, which is understandable. Jim Brown was not in a pass-heavy era. We then go on to the receiving yards. Walter Payton, 4,538, Barry Sanders, 2,921, and Jim Brown, 2,499. Career receiving yards per game. Peyton, 23.8. Barry Sanders, 19. And Jim Brown, 21. Career rushing touchdowns. Walter Payton, 110. Jim Brown, 106. And Barry Sanders, 99. Career receiving touchdowns. Jim Brown, 20. Walter Payton, 15. And Barry Sanders, 10. Career touchdowns. Jim Brown, 126. Walter Payton, 125. And Barry Sanders, 109. Touchdowns per game. So I went by a percentage here. The percentage for Jim Brown, I don't know if you guys could guess this, but it's over 100% of the games. He scored a touchdown in 107% of the games that he played. So that means that he scored over a touchdown per game. Barry Sanders had a touchdown 71% of his games, and Walter Payton had a touchdown 66% of his games. Fumbles was interesting. I actually thought Barry Sanders would have fumbled more often than these guys because he was smaller and more agile, but in fact, Barry Sanders led this category with the least amount of fumbles at only 41 fumbles. Jim Brown had 57 fumbles, and Walter Payton had 86 fumbles. All-purpose yards per game, Jim Brown had 125.5, Sanders had 118.9, and Payton had 111.9. So that is rushing yards, receiving yards put together per game. And Jim Brown takes that category. He also holds the record for that. All-purpose yardage, Walter Payton has 21,264 yards. Sanders has 18,190 yards, and Jim Brown has 14,811 yards. So breaking that down into wins per player, Walter Payton took 7 categories, Jim Brown took 6 categories, and Barry Sanders took only 1 category in the career stats department. Accolades. Let's start off with the team championships. Now, I don't think we've been talking a lot about quarterbacks over the course of the last couple of videos, and I do believe championships matter more for quarterbacks than any other position, really in pro sports, because the quarterback, again, is the most responsible for winning or losing a game at a position, in my opinion, in any sport. You could argue maybe goalie in hockey, but other than that, I think championships should be, next to quarterback. But for running back, you don't have too much determination on how good your team is going to be or how bad they're going to be. It's a plus, but it's not a big deal. So Jim Brown had 1 championship. Walter Payton had 1 as well, 1985, with the great defense of the Bears. Barry Sanders, of course, had 0. A lot to do with the players that played with him. We'll get to that in a little while. The MVPs, Jim Brown had 3 MVPs, Walter Payton had 1, and Barry Sanders also had 1. The All-Pros and Pro Bowls, Barry Sanders had 10 All-Pros and 10 Pro Bowls. If you actually remember, Barry Sanders only played 10 seasons, so that means he was an All-Pro every single season he played in the NFL. Walter Payton had 8 All-Pros, and Jim Brown also had 8 All-Pros. In the Pro Bowl section, Walter Payton and Jim Brown both went to the Pro Bowl 9 times. So Barry Sanders went to the All-Pro team and the Pro Bowl 10 out of 10 times. Jim Brown, I think, went 9 out of 9 times to the Pro Bowl and 8 out of 9 times to the All-Pro team. The Offensive Player of the Year, Barry Sanders won it twice. Walter Payton won it once, and Brown never had the opportunity to win an Offensive Player of the Year because there was never an award for him, so I have no data on that. But I did want to throw that in there for Barry Sanders, who could have won potentially more than 1 MVP, winning 2 Offensive Player of the Years. The All-Decade team. All 3 of them made it in their decade, but Walter Payton made 2 decades. He made 1970 and 1980. 1970 was kind of interesting that he did make the team, considering all the great players and running backs that played in that era, but Walter Payton did sneak in there. The 75th anniversary team, actually Jim Brown and Walter Payton make it over Barry Sanders. I did want to throw this extra accolade in there. Barry Sanders did win the Offensive Rookie of the Year. He was great the first year he stepped into the NFL, while Walter Payton and Jim Brown weren't great initially. It took them a little bit of time. Jim Brown was very good, but they didn't give him enough opportunity for him to be great the first season, like a Barry Sanders. So the accolades goes to 5 for Brown, 4 for Sanders, and 3 for Payton. The next category is achievements. So achievements is basically like how many times did you lead the league in touchdowns? How many times did you lead the league in yards? How many 1,000-yard seasons did you have? That sort of thing. So let's start off with the 1,000-yard seasons. Barry Sanders had 10 out of 10 1,000-yard seasons, which has never been done before, or before him or after him. Nobody has had 10 out of 10 1,000-yard seasons. I don't know if that's ever going to be done again. Like, that's absolutely outstanding, especially due to a lot of injuries that happen at the running back position. Walter Payton got 10 as well, but he did it in 13 seasons. Jim Brown had 7 1,000-yard seasons in 9 seasons. Again, Jim Brown played less games per season, so he could have probably gotten that a couple more times. He did get injured more than Sanders did, though, so that is something to take into account. 2,000-yard seasons, Barry Sanders had 1, Payton had 0, and Brown had 0. Brown would have had 1. I think he had 1,800 yards, but he played 2 less games than Barry Sanders. So he probably would have got it, but Barry Sanders did get a 2,000-yard season, and the rest of them didn't. 2,000 all-purpose yard seasons, Walter Payton had 4, Sanders had 2, and Brown had 1. Again, this is taken into account because Brown didn't have the same amount of games played, first of all, and he also didn't receive the ball as often as these other guys, because the game was more run-centric in that era when Brown played. As for Payton, he was the dual back, which again gives him an advantage in this category, but also helps him in the debate because he was more of a dual threat than the other runners. Barry Sanders had 2,000-yard seasons heavily on the rushing aspect of that. He actually had a 2,000-yard season just rushing the ball, so that's one of them. The next one, leading the league in yards per game, rushing. Brown had 8 seasons leading the league in yards per game. I don't think that will ever be done again. Barry Sanders had 4 and Payton had 1, which was surprising. Next, leading the league in all-purpose yards. Brown 6, Sanders 2, and Payton 2. So Brown was very good in the all-purpose category for his time. So that's something to take into account. When we look at the all-purpose seasons, like how many 1,000-yard, how many 2,000-yard all-purpose seasons, where Brown only had 1, he was still the best in his era for achieving all-purpose yardage. He had 6 all-purpose yard, seasons where he led the league. Sanders and Payton both had 2. Leading the league in attempts, Brown had 6, Payton had 4, and Sanders actually had 0. So Sanders was more of a guy that, in today's standards, I guess you would compare a Barry Sanders to a Jamal Charles, when Walter Payton was like an Adrian Peterson in terms of the amount of attempts that they got. Rushing leaders. Brown was the leader of the NFL 8 times in rushing. Sanders was 4, and Payton was only once, which I believe was his MVP season. Touchdown rushing leader. Brown led the league in touchdowns 5 times, which is the record. Sanders once, and Payton once. Leading the league in rushing and receiving touchdowns, Brown again had 5, Sanders had 2, and Payton had 1. And seasons over 5 yards per carry, Sanders had 5 out of his 10 seasons over 5 yards per carry. Brown had 5 of his 9 seasons, and Payton had 1. So in that category of achievements, Brown wins with 7, Sanders has 3, and Payton has 1 category 1. We then go to the playoff stats, which is something a little bit underrated in terms of, the great running backs in NFL history, but a lot of great running backs played on bad teams and teams that weren't very successful in the playoffs. As we see with these 3 guys, the most successful guy in the playoffs was actually Walter Payton, who played 9 games in the playoffs, but was 4-5. He did win a Super Bowl, but he was 4-5 in the playoffs. He had 180 attempts, a 3.5 yards per attempt, 632 yards, 2 touchdowns, 22 receptions, and 178 yards. The actual best per game running back in the playoffs is Barry Sanders of these 3. He only played 6 games, and a lot of people look at him as losing 5 of them and winning 1. But per game, Sanders did the most for his team in the playoffs. He had 91 attempts, 4.24 yards per attempt, which is much better than both of the other guys. Payton had 3.51, and Jim Brown had 3.65. So Barry was far ahead in yards per attempt. 386 yards, 1 touchdown, and 21 receptions, which is 1 short of Payton in 3 less games, for 111 yards. Jim Brown had 66 attempts in 4 games, 3.65 yards per attempt, 251 yards, 1 touchdown, 8 receptions, and 99 yards. Now for Jim Brown, it's interesting because he didn't have to play as many playoff games because the playoff format was condensed. It wasn't as big as you see with Sanders and Payton. It was just Jim Brown had to play 1 or 2 games just to win the championship. But the winner in the playoffs is Sanders. In my opinion, that's what the statistics say. It's very difficult to determine that. I mean, Payton did win the championship, but Sanders was more effective. So I would say that Sanders was the better playoff running back. Now let's go to the records. The records is interesting. Barry Sanders has the most records. I would say Jim Brown has the most impressive records, and Walter Payton has the other records. So for me, Barry Sanders, He had 15 career touchdown runs over 50 yards, which is the most, of course. Most games with 150 or more scrimmage yards. Most games with 150 or more rushing yards. 2 less 100-yard games than the leader of 100-yard games in Emmitt Smith. But of course, he played far less games than Emmitt Smith did. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Barry Sanders, if he would have played a few more games in his career compared to Emmitt Smith, he would have totally beat that record with 100-yard games. In 1997, Barry Sanders rushed for an NFL record 14 straight 100-yard games, which is still the record. Most consecutive 1,500-yard seasons, most consecutive 1,400-yard seasons, most seasons with 1,400 yards rushing, and most consecutive 1,100-yard seasons, which is 10. So every single year of his career, Barry Sanders had 1,100 yards rushing. Jim Brown, he had the most games with 3 touchdowns. He has the highest touchdowns per game. He has the most seasons leading the league in attempts, yards per game, scrimmage yards, and touchdowns. He has the highest career average yards per game, the only person over 100, and the highest average yards from scrimmage at 125, as we've already covered in the video. Walter Payton held the NFL record, as you know, of attempts, yards, and touchdowns until Emmitt Smith broke all 3 of those records. Walter Payton also had consecutive starts for a running back from 1975 to 1987 with 170 consecutive starts. He also has the most consecutive seasons leading the league in attempts, and he has the most games with 100 or more scrimmage yards. So those are the records for each running back. Take them as you will. I thought that Barry Sanders were the most impressive in terms of, we've already given the category of achievements to Jim Brown, which was most of his records, like leading the league in attempts, leading the league in yards, leading in that. But Barry Sanders, to me, most of his records were consistent records, which I think are just as impressive, if not more impressive, than Jim Brown's records. So I would say that Barry's records are slightly more impressive, even though they all have great records, and they're all records. We then go on to the variables. The variables here, I wanted to condense it to Barry Sanders versus Jim Brown, because Walter Payton, I think, had a great supporting cast for most of his career. He had better quarterbacks than Barry did. He had better defenses. He had better offensive lines. He had better weapons. I think Walter Payton, team for team, pound for pound, had more help than Barry Sanders did. I think there's no player that is as great as Barry Sanders that ever had less help than Barry did. Barry has had the least amount of help of any elite top 20 all-time player than Barry Sanders. Not Dan Marino, not John Elway, not another Adrian Peterson, maybe not Randy Moss. None of these guys had less help than Barry Sanders offensively or defensively. So for me, looking at these variables, Jim Brown only had 14 other lead backs to compete with in his time in the NFL. So if you consider his records are very impressive, and he would still probably lead most categories despite only having 14 other backs around him in his time in the NFL. But if you consider that Barry Sanders, his first year in the league, had to compete with 27 other starting running backs, while Jim Brown only had to compete with 14, that does say something. Jim Brown's teams never suffered a losing season. I know that some people might direct their attention to Jim Brown as a reason why that happened, but if you look at Sanders, I mean, he wasn't the reason why his team was losing. He was the reason why they were winning when they were winning. They had 5 winning seasons and 5 losing seasons. He ran for over 2,000 yards, and his team only went 9-7, which is absolutely crazy. Jim Brown's career included Paul Brown, Lou Groza, who is considered one of the best tackles of that generation, Gene Hickerson, who's also considered a great guard, Bobby Mitchell, who created the great tandem in Cleveland, and Paul Warfield, who was a great receiver for the Browns. Barry Sanders had no Hall of Fame coach, no Hall of Fame lineman, no Hall of Fame quarterback, or no Hall of Fame anything. at all. Barely even Pro Bowlers. Sanders rushed for 6.1 yards per carry on a 9-7 team in 1997. That's crazy. Brown also had the size of he was the size of an average defensive lineman in his day. Now, I'm not trying to put down Jim Brown because, as we'll see in a bit, I think Jim Brown will probably lead in most categories. But for me, you have to look at Jim Brown's dominance and be like, well, was Barry Sanders, like what he did, almost or just as and even more impressive than what Jim Brown did? Considering Jim Brown had more help, considering the era he played in, he was the same size as the defenders, and considering the era he played in, the competition wasn't as great. You have to consider those things in doing a discussion like this. On the negative side of Barry Sanders, people will bring up that Barry had the most negative yards of all time. Well, how do you think Barry Sanders had the most 50-plus yard touchdowns? The same way that he had the most negative yards, because he had to run backwards just to escape defenders because his offensive linemen couldn't block. He was trying to run away from them. That is why he had the most negative yards of all time. Now let's go to the skills chart. Now, what's the skills chart? It debuts on the Bottom Line Views debate series. The skills chart is just basically saying what a player in their skill set is better at than the comparison. So for me, I have rusher, receiver, dominance, consistency, longevity, career stats, per game stats, accolades, achievements, playoffs, and records. Starting off with the rusher. Who is the greatest rusher of all time? By statistic, it would be Jim Brown. By era, I would say it would be Barry Sanders. So for me, it's kind of a tie. But because Barry Sanders never had great linemen or anything around him, I would slightly lean towards Barry Sanders as the greatest rusher in NFL history. Receiving. Walter Payton was the best receiver, and I don't think you really need to discuss that in terms of these three players. Now, there's no Marshall Faulk in this conversation, so Walter Payton wins this. Dominance. Brown, obviously. Consistency. Sanders. Longevity. Payton. Career stats, Payton. Per game stats, Brown. Accolades, Brown. Achievements, Brown. Playoff performance, Sanders. Records, Sanders. Even though Brown, I already gave him the achievements, which again, like I said in the records, are just like his records. So I gave Sanders the records. So that skills chart adds up to 4 for Brown, 4 for Sanders, and 2 for Payton. Now, how I added up the total for each category was using 10 points for a first place, 5 points for a second place, and 0 points for third. I just left third alone. I just did first and second and gave them the points. So, as we look at this chart here on the screen, Jim Brown wins 215 points, 19 first place, 5 seconds. Sanders, 205 points, 12 firsts, and 17 seconds. And Payton, 155 points, way below, 11 firsts, and 9 seconds. Now, the data to me shows that it was a 2-horse race. It was Jim Brown versus Barry Sanders. Walter Payton was slightly below that. Now, do I think Walter Payton is the most versatile running back of all of them? Yes, because he could catch the ball, he could run the ball, he could do all that sort of stuff. He was a very inspirational runner, the way he ran. Barry Sanders, in my opinion, is the most graceful and interesting and, just fun player to watch. As a rusher, he was probably the best. But Jim Brown, in his era and of all time, 19 first place of these categories is pretty crazy. Jim Brown, to me, by the data, says that he is the greatest running back of all time. Now, you could argue that Barry Sanders is the greatest because maybe you think his career is more impressive. And that's up for debate, in my opinion. I showed you the debate here. It's plausible that Barry Sanders could be the greatest running back of all time. But to me, the data overwhelmingly shows that Jim Brown was the most dominant running back of all time. In crucial categories like, yards per game, MVPs, touchdowns, all that sort of stuff. Jim Brown wins out, and I think that makes him the greatest running back of all time. So Jim Brown first, Barry Sanders second, Walter Payton third. That is the order I am going to stick with. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more NFL debates just like this. I'm really excited to hear what you guys have to say, not only about the debate, who do you think is the greatest running back of these three, but about the video. Do you think I should do, something a little bit different? Do you think I should add anything or take anything away? And did you like the video in general? Also, what should the next debate be? I've been looking at the comments, replying to a lot of them, as many as I can, and getting to that as well. But also, I want to hear what you guys want to do in terms of the debates, because I'm writing them down and I'm getting to them. That's how I did this video. That's how I did the Payton and Brady video. So if you have a great debate that I think a lot of people would enjoy, put it in the comment section. I'll check it out and see if I agree that it would be a great debate for the channel. And if it is, I'll definitely include your name in the video like I did today. Thank you, Alexander, for the Sanders, Brown, and Payton video. It's Mitch of the Bottom Line View. Thanks you guys for watching once again. Subscribe to the channel and like the video. Peace out.